And welcome to this edition of the Native News Update on this Tuesday, August 3rd. I'm your host for today's program. And today we're going to be speaking with first Marley Shebala, reporting from the Navajo Nation about the elections that are taking place today. And secondly, an interview with Mark Trahant, who has come back from Washington, D.C. from the recent signing of the Indian Country Law and Order Bill.
Marley, it's election day on the Navajo Nation today. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're expecting?
Because we have a write-in candidate.
Okay.
And so there's only going to be 2 of them after all the voting has been completed at 7 p.m. and the election results come in. And generally the election results are finished about 10 or even later, but because there are only 24 council positions, the election results could be coming in sooner, maybe finished sooner. And a lot of people are pretty sure that of the presidential candidates, that one of the final 2 will be Linda Lovejoy, who also was one of the 2 candidates that went to general election 4 years ago against President Joe Shirley.
Okay. Are you doing that on any kind of scientific poll, or is that just kind of like what's going on in the neighborhood talk?
Or what's going on in the neighborhood, which is very scientific too, you know.
Well, I do believe there's a point to that. And how many districts are up for election, district representatives?
There are 24 council positions. We have 24 council delegates. There were 88, and then they had the initiative election. And so the people said, no, we want 24 council delegates.
Good. What kind of weather do you have today, and what kind of a turnout are you expecting? Do you think it's going to be relatively large?
Oh, yeah, because this is the first time that the people are going to be voting for 24 council delegates instead of 88. And people really see this reduction as government reform, a change in the Navajo government, and the weather is wonderful. It's a little bit overcast. It's raining in places. Well, you know, Church Rock, which is out near Gallup, New Mexico, they had to move their polling site because one of the bridges was washed out because of the rain.
Okay. Tomorrow you're going to give us a full-fledged report on the Navajo Nation elections.
Right. We'll have that for you.
Okay, we'll look forward to seeing you. Thanks a lot for checking in, Marley. We'll talk to you again tomorrow. Thank you. Mark Trahant, you were in Washington, D.C. last week for the signing of the Indian Country Law and Order Act by President Obama. We did a little bit of an interview with Lori Townsend yesterday about that from an Alaskan perspective, but give the viewers here a little bit of an idea of the overall nature of the bill, if you would, please.
Well, the overall nature of the bill is, I would say, primarily law enforcement. It increases powers for tribal governments to enforce applicable laws involving violence. I think as far as that goes, it's a good thing, and I wrote a column as such. But I think it's important to note that violence is also a public health issue, and that's where you're not seeing resources put into the problem. Behavioral health has not had the kind of increases needed. Substance abuse counseling, all sorts of public health issues, I think, arise out of this.
Does it appear that most of the money, now there's got to be certain elements of it, more law enforcement personnel on reservations, I assume, is
Right.
given. You indicated jurisdictional issues, which is Alaska apparently had a pilot program worth $50 million that was literally taken out because somehow Alaska's congressmen and senators feared that it would give, quote, Indian country more jurisdictional powers.
Right.
How do you view that issue within the context of that bill?
Well, I mean, that's true. And Alaska was that element is part of it. They did advance jurisdiction a little bit, though, so I think it's not fair to say that they wouldn't go anywhere, because in many ways they gave deputy U.S. authority to tribes, and that could have significant jurisdictional impact down the road.
Okay, and by that you're indicating that there's some kind of a cross-deputization or the authority for tribes to deputize them as federal officials that make that
Right.
process easier?
And to go directly to the U.S. Attorney for prosecution. And I mean, basically, the rub has been for both domestic violence and a big one is felony DUI, where you're not able to get the U.S. Attorney's Office to actually follow through and do the prosecution. And one of the things this does is it requires the Justice Department to do a report and to publish the reasons when they don't prosecute. And that could be interesting.
So, and to some extent that makes some sense. I mean, federal prosecutors are overwhelmed with major
Right.
crimes and corruption, and for a fifth offense for drunk driving, felony status, the state, and part of it's got to do with this hobnob of jurisdiction. In some cases, the state lacks jurisdiction to move against these individuals. U.S. federal prosecutors are overwhelmed. They're not going to move against them. They just avoid the judicial system altogether.
Right.
They walk free.
Right. And this allows tribes to enhance it to 3 years for some offenses. So there be more tribal jails or prisons in some cases. But again, I'm not sure. I mean, I just don't think you can lock up enough people to solve this problem. It's got to be a behavioral change issue and to get people rethinking violence in the community. And that, I think, falls much more on the public health system than it does law enforcement.
And did we see money go into that public health system with some of the other bills that were passed earlier this year?
Well, again, this is just an authorization bill, so the appropriations process is separate, and we haven't seen that yet. We'll have to wait and see what the outcome of that is.
You indicated that you thought that depending on the impact of this bill, that it could be a savings in the healthcare cost. Explain that a little bit.
Well, it's just if you can keep people out of emergency rooms and keep people out. I mean, you got the high cost part of health system when you're involving violence, and if you can cut that down, it does save money to the health system.
You can put criminals away. You might avoid a shooting in which you have a victim that needs major surgery, kind of a thing.
Right.
Domestic abuse. Did you see anything unique in this bill, or what kind of reaction?
Well, the reaction was great. The most unique thing, I think, is the continued and sustained interest in this President of the United States and Indian country. It's unparalleled. I mean, we haven't seen that in a long time where a president's been this interested. And you can argue about whether or not this bill goes far enough or whether any of the bills goes far enough. But what you cannot argue is that this president is interested.
Okay, and you see that in the fact that there is initiatives in healthcare, initiatives in the passage of the Indian Country Healthcare Act, and now this one?
Right, and in the budget, and pretty much across the board. I mean, having White House officials from Indian country, you can just go down the list. You just haven't seen this before. Even in the Nixon administration, which was very committed.
Very much so, from what I can remember. Docs are cops. And that's your domestic violence issue in regards to this? Tell us a little bit about that column.
Again, it's just thinking that we need to have more emphasis on the public health side. One of the things the bill does that's great is working with the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act is lays out a set of protocols for docs to actually question rape victims and go through a series of steps. That's all good. But again, I would just like to see a lot more money put into behavioral health, where you could actually change the behavior of people before it becomes a crime.
Okay. It seems to me that at least in part what this bill is addressing is the fact that in Indian country we have one of the highest, it appears to be one of the highest rape incidents of rape in anywhere.
No question about that. It is the highest.
Lori was describing, for example, in Alaska, the difficulty of something like that. You have a rape occur in a village in the bush, in a remote area. It might take 2 or 3 days for Alaskan state troopers to arrive there to investigate. They've lost evidence and those kinds of things. Is that the kind of situation you're finding in other parts of Indian country, or is it just disregard?
It's disregard. I mean, one of the most powerful stories was told, and I have to get her name right, at the White House. And she talked about 16 years ago, a violent attack. And
Is this Lisa Marie
it is.
Lyotte?
Right.
Okay.
And 16 years ago, just a terrible violent attack, unprosecuted. The person was finally prosecuted after a rape of a teenager in a community, but not for her crime. And so that's the kind of thing from a law enforcement perspective that you'd like to see fixed, that hole in the jurisdiction.
Okay. Overall, you think that's the bill is a positive thing for Indian country? That's what you're hearing from the tribal reaction side of things?
For the most part, yeah. A step forward is the way I'd put it. I think you got to match it with the money, though. And I think a critical factor is we're coming up very soon against some really big budget cuts. So the more we can lock down some of this stuff, the better.
Okay. My understanding that as a part of that bill, there was also enhancements done to the Indian Arts and Crafts law.
Right.
Are you aware of any of the particulars of that?
No, to tell you the truth, I skimmed over it because I was thinking of the public health angle when the whole time I was there.
Sure. It's interesting that I raised that issue with Lori Townsend in Alaska, and she said that one of the things that Alaska Native and Eskimo people are doing to kind of cut around the issue of authenticity is utilizing the internet to feature your artists. So your artists are telling them about a piece of artwork, and in part because it's not simple beadwork, it's a lot of crafted carving, ivory, meticulous type of products coming out of Alaska Natives, generally speaking, and they were going online and saying, here's what I've got for sale, here's what it is. So you're actually seeing and judging the artist is saying this is an authentic piece of artwork. So
makes sense.
What's coming up next in terms of legislative issues?
Everyone's going to go home for the next few weeks, so it'll be quiet for a while. And when they come back, they're all going to be positioning for who's going to win election. Will the House be controlled by Republicans or the Senate in the next cycle? I think it's pretty well looking to me, and I could be wrong, but I don't think the Republicans can take the Senate. I just think the odds are too high. But the House is certainly in play, and that could be interesting.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, most of those primaries are coming up in September, aren't they?
Right.
We have
so in Washington, they're going to be all election all the time when they come back.
We have the first primary here on the Navajo Nation going on today for a downsized legislature. You used to live down there. You're married to a Navajo. What are the implications of that election today?
Well, it's interesting. The group that pushed for the reform has been running ads naming the candidates who are for the smaller size council. I think small is just going to be kind of a narrative that goes through a lot of things. Can you do things in a smaller way rather than always getting bigger? And I think the way they thought through this is very interesting.
Is it something that should be applied to Indian country in general? You know, there's been a downsizing of 20 to 25% of the gaming revenues, and some tribes have done a lot of layoffs and cutbacks.
Right. And not just Indian country, it's across the board in the world, as a matter of fact.
Okay.
Can we be smaller?
Can we be smaller and still function better?
Right.
Where are you headed next on your healthcare initiative story?
I'm kind of mapped out the last 5 columns to end in September. The next one focuses on how you count for the metric of both Medicaid, particularly for Medicaid, but for Indian Health Service. For example, for many years, anyone could say they're Indian, and that kind of ends the story. It's self-identification. But under the new law, the IRS is the enforcer of that. So if someone writes down and accepts benefits for being Indian, it's a felony. And that's been true in arts and crafts before, but this is the first time more of in a general sense. And I think that could make it very interesting in how the counting game goes on.
Well, it's interesting. There was some guy in Ohio who declared his house a reservation, so maybe there'll be less of that going on in the future. Mark, thanks for joining us today. We'll talk to you again perhaps next week sometime and catch up with you on the healthcare trail somewhere.
Sounds good.
And that is the latest roundup of news from Indian Country on this edition of the Native News Update.